Welcome to our podcast, Passport to Assessment, Navigating Assessment in the Middle Years Program, brought to you by Jenna Lero, the MYP Coordinator at Meade High School, and Vanessa Facer, the MYP Coordinator at MacArthur Middle School. We wanted to welcome you all, whether you're a parent new to the Middle Years Program, or if you've had a child in the program at MacArthur or Meade for a few years. This podcast is intended to share information about what makes assessment in the Middle Years Program different. Two questions that we want to explore throughout this session are: how does MYP assessment look different from traditional assessment? And what are ways to support your child in MYP assessment? We hope that there will be three outcomes of your time exploring this podcast. The first is to deepen your understanding of assessment in the Middle Years Program. The second is to explore applying the rubrics. And the third is to seek feedback from you all about assessment, what questions you have, or what things you're wondering. Speaking of which, after this session, we will share a Google form with you. This will be our way of receiving information, questions from you all as you watch the podcast. You can feel free to jot down some things that you're wondering if we're not able to answer it as you listen. If you have a specific concern about your child or a specific class, we would encourage you to reach out directly to the classroom teacher or the coordinator. But as this session is a little more general about assessment across the school. In the Middle Years Program, there are three things we want you to understand about assessment. First, the main purpose of assessment in an IB program is to support and encourage student learning. However, we know that we use assessment to determine grades. Summative assessment is the process where we look at all of the things that the student has done over the course of the unit, and we give them an opportunity to show their understanding. In our schools, our teachers work in teams to determine what the criteria is for those assessments. So let's get started talking about achievement. If these three people were your applicants, what information does their qualifications tell you? I want you to think about how you might make an informed hiring decision. So let's imagine that there are three chefs being considered for a job. The first chef graduated with an A- average. That's the information you know about him. The second chef graduated in the top 10% of his class. The third chef graduated, and on a scale of 0 to 7, 7 being the highest, that chef earned a 6 in knowledge of nutrition, a 7 in cooking skills, a 6 in whether or not the students like the food that was served, and a 7 in kitchen cleanliness. Who would you hire and why? So something to think about is what kind of information you receive from these different marks. What do you know about someone who has an A- average versus a top 10% of his class versus different criteria used to evaluate an applicant? Throughout tonight's podcast, we'll be talking about some different ways that we use criteria in the Middle Years Program. And we believe that criteria gives parents and students a little more information than just a percentage grade. It tells us a little bit more about how they're performing on different aspects of a class. So let's practice first by using a rubric. Let's talk about what assignment we're going to engage in tonight. So I would want you to imagine that we asked you to do the following. Using Play-Doh or any kind of clay, we asked you to create a sculpture. It has to be freestanding. It has to be stable so it can't fall over very easily. It has to be a recognizable object. And maybe it's something that represents your family or your child from the first half of the year, from the first semester. I also would want you to take the opportunity to practice some techniques with your clay or your Play-Doh in rolling and joining. So we actually did this activity in person with a parent group, and we wanted to share with you briefly what they created. these are 3 images that they created in response to that challenge. One parent talked about how they spent some time at the beach. Another parent talked about how they spent time together as a family. And the third parent talked about how they spent some time in the sun. So after you created these sculptures, I want you to think about if we asked you to rank the art. So if you were to do that activity and you had to rank which person produced the best versus the weakest example, I want you to think of how you might do that. So I'm going to give you a chance to do that and show you the images again. So in your opinion, I want you to rank these in your mind from best to weakest example. And now I'm going to ask you to complete a second thinking job. This time, I want you to grade the work. Give it a letter grade. So first you have to consider, how did you determine your grade, and how would this letter grade help you to set a goal for your next project? So I'll show you those images again and invite you to decide what grade would you give each of these based on the directions you were given. So we did that activity in person with parents at a workshop, and our conversation was very rich about how would you rank them, how do you decide which one is better than another based on the directions that were given. The third thing we want you to consider is the use of a rubric to do the same assignment. So if we were to give you a rubric, this example right here uses criteria, MYP criteria from the arts, which our teachers at both MacArthur and Meade use. And you'll see the MYP descriptor on the left-hand column, and then you'll see the task-specific descriptor on the right-hand side. So I would invite you to take a look at the rubric, which we also provided for you as a document, and determine how you might use the rubric to do the same thing with the 3 pieces of Play-Doh art. All of our courses in the middle years program uses rubrics with descriptions of what a 7 to 8, what a 5 to 6, what a 3 to 4, what a 1 to 2, and what a 0 would look like. And these rubrics are the same for each subject starting in 6th grade at MacArthur Middle School or any other middle years program school up through 10th grade at Meade High School or any other middle years program high school. So the nice thing is that your students become very familiar with the criteria for each of the subjects. Their rubrics, while they might be assessing different things, the rubrics do not change in what they're looking for. Many times our assessments ask students to show a performance of understanding. So this might be different from traditional paper-pencil tests. Performances of understanding allow students both to build and demonstrate their understanding in and across subjects. They are based on the theory that understanding is not something you have, like a set of facts that we might possess, but rather is something we can do. So many times, students on their summative assessments from both 6th grade up until 10th grade, students are asked to show what they understand, not just by reciting facts or being able to answer multiple choice questions, but something that they can produce. Now you might be asking yourself, how does this work with traditional letter grades and percentages? And we'll talk about that next. But we hope that looking at this example of the clay work that we did and taking a look at an example of a rubric might better help us to understand how teachers are determining how well your student is performing in the different subjects that they're taking. So, while we know that MYP assessment looks a little different, we also know that we are a traditional public school in the United States. And for that reason, Anne Arundel County Public Schools has created a conversion chart so that when your child scores a certain score on the rubric, which is represented on the left-hand side under IB score range, the county has determined a way to convert that to a percentage grade. So that when a student earns a 1 out of 8, that is not a straight percentage. The description on the rubric is much more rigorous than getting a 4 out of 8 equating to a 50%. So therefore, the county has done a lot of research and analysis of what an IB score would equate to when it comes to a percentage grade. So that you know as parents, if your child were to get a 6 out of 8, that might tell a child one thing based on the rubric, but for you as a parent, it's good to know that that's about what you would think an 89% would earn. So that's a high B quality of work. So I want you to think for a second, how does this change the conversations you might have with your child about school and or his classes? We wanted to show you an example of what an assessment in the middle years program might look like. So because we're not able to share some of the current assessments as your children are currently taking them, and for security reasons, we can't share those in a podcast posted on a website, there is an example attached in the documents available for you for this podcast. And we want you to take a second to look at what do you see, what do you think, and what do you wonder. This is an example of a performance of understanding, as we mentioned a few minutes ago. So instead of students just providing data or providing facts about music in the decades or what they know about the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, this is an opportunity for them to explore and show how lyrics connect with this idea. So while you had time to look at one specific example for social studies, which is no longer an assessment that we currently give, here are a few examples of other kinds of MYP summative assessments. For mathematics, students engage in a snowflake project in which they have to apply the math they've learned. They create a city plan, and they also have a catapult project. In language and literature, students have to come up with a speech using rhetorical devices and research human rights violations. And in individuals and societies, they engage in document-based question essays as well as wax museum assessments. So these assessments are just a few examples, as we're not able to share a ton of ways that students are engaging in middle years program assessments that might be different than a traditional paper pencil multiple choice test. When they take these assessments, your student's grade sheet may look something like this. So this is an example pulled from English 10, but this might be very similar in any of the subjects in grades 6 through 10. So what you'll notice here is if you look at the first assignment, there's always the title of the assignment, and then there'll be a category identified, and the category should be one of the 4 criteria for that subject. So the first one here was graded on using language, the second one was graded on organization, the third was graded on assessment, and then the fifth one was graded on producing text. So students had different assignments that were assessing different things. So the second assignment was just grading their organization of their speech organizer. The first assignment was looking at how they used vocabulary or analyzed vocabulary, sentence structure, grammar in somebody else's speech. Under the date, that'll tell you when the assignment was given or graded. And then the score is entered as an MYP score that correlates with the conversion we looked at earlier, this conversion. So this grade sheet will tell you a little bit about how your child is performing on the rubrics. And you can consider the conversion if you're trying to better understand what might an MYP 5 equate to. So during this session, we had hoped that you would have a little bit of a deeper understanding of assessment, that you could explore an MYP rubric example, and now we would love your feedback. So please feel free to click on the link to the Google survey and enter any questions or insights you've gained, along with your email if you would like to receive the frequently asked questions. Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to dialoguing with you in the future.